In the heart of America's wild landscapes, ordinary lives collide with the extraordinary forces of nature. From the rugged mountains of Montana to the remote trails of Alaska, individuals are thrust into harrowing encounters that test their instincts and resolve. A compassionate act leads to a deadly confrontation. A camping trip spirals into chaos, and a fishing expedition turns into a fight for survival. Each story unveils the unpredictable nature of the wilderness, where the line between safety and peril blurs. Will courage and quick thinking be enough to overcome the primal challenges that lie ahead? Join us as we delve into these gripping tales of resilience and the raw power of the wild. It was mid-fall in 2023 as Jack Lawson moved silently through the dense underbrush of Montana's mountain range. At 24 years old, Jack had spent more than half his life hunting, encouraged by his father and grandfather. He was the perfect hunter. He had exceptional skills, but he also possessed something that others lacked: a deep respect for the wild. He hunted to sustain himself and his new family, his fiancée, Carly, and their 2-year-old daughter, Ava. Hunting wasn't a sport to him, and he always thanked the land for its gifts. His upbringing taught him that nature was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. Jack respected that balance. The day was unusually cold for mid-fall. The sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray clouds that hung low over the peaks. Jack's boots crunched on frost-laden leaves as he descended a ridge, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He planned to track a herd of elk that had passed through earlier, their prints fresh in the snow-dusted earth. But then, a sound stopped him. A low, guttural moan, unlike anything he had ever heard. It was a sound of pain, and Jack was sure the source was an injured animal. Jack followed the sound to a small clearing, his heart tightening as he spotted the source. A massive grizzly bear lay slumped against a fallen log. Her fur was matted with blood, a deep gash torn across her back, likely from a fight with another bear, or worse, an encounter with a poacher's trap. Her breaths came in labored gasps, her sides heaving with the effort. Then Jack noticed her unusual size, a certain heaviness that clung to her. He could bet the bear was pregnant. What made the situation unusual was that grizzlies usually don't get pregnant until they hibernate. Jack had no idea how a bear not yet hibernating could be pregnant. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The animal was suffering. He stood frozen for a long while, not knowing how to proceed, or whether it was his place at all to take any kind of action. He had no desire to interfere with nature, but the sight of her suffering gnawed at him. Against every instinct, he lowered his rifle, set his pack down, and pulled out some venison jerky he had planned to eat later on his trip. The bear's eyes flicked toward him, glassy and dull with pain. Slowly, Jack tossed the meat onto the ground several feet away. He expected her to ignore it, but to his surprise, the bear stretched her neck forward, her jaws closing weakly around the offering. As the bear ate, Jack relaxed slightly, watching her chew with an almost serene determination. However, as he observed her, he debated whether to put the bear out of her misery. He crouched to retrieve another strip of jerky, convinced she was too injured to pose a threat. The bear's labored breathing seemed to ease as she ate. But then, as he tossed another piece closer, something changed. Her eyes, once glazed, sharpened. A growl rumbled low in her chest, and the fur on her neck bristled. Jack barely had time to react. The bear lunged with an unimaginable ferocity, so different from her earlier weakness, her massive bulk moving faster than he thought possible. Jack stumbled backward, fumbling for his rifle, but the beast was on him before his fingers found the stock. She slammed into him, a wall of muscle and fury knocking him to the ground. Gone was the suffering creature. This was a crazed beast, an apex predator on the hunt. The bear's claws sliced into Jack's flesh. Her teeth snapped inches from his face as he struggled to push her away, his hands scrabbling against her blood-slick fur, narrowly missing her sharp teeth. Jack's brain swam in pure adrenaline. He had to survive. His senses narrowed. He kicked out wildly, his boot connecting with the animal's wound. The bear roared in agony, rearing back for a moment, and Jack seized the opportunity to roll away. His hands found the rifle, but before he could raise it, the bear charged again, swiping at his legs. The blow sent him sprawling, the weapon skittering out of reach. Jack scrambled backward, trying to ignore the pain that blurred his vision. He could barely breathe. Grabbing a fallen branch, he swung it wildly as the bear loomed over him. The makeshift weapon cracked against her skull, but it felt like hitting a boulder. She swiped again, her claws tearing through his forearm. Blood spattered the snow, the stark red a horrifying contrast against the white. The bear's roar filled the clearing, drowning out the pounding of Jack's heart. She was relentless, driven by some primal force that Jack understood all too well. The bear, much like him, felt the instinct to survive and protect her young. Each swipe, each bite, brought Jack closer to the edge of consciousness. His strength was fading, his vision tunneling. But deep inside, a spark of defiance remained. He refused to die here, not like this, not without seeing his family again. Ava deserved to grow up with a father. Jack's hand found his hunting knife, the blade slick with sweat and blood as he gripped it tightly. When the bear lunged again, he drove the knife into her deep wound, the force of the blow twisting his wrist painfully. The bear let out a deafening bellow, staggering back with the blade still lodged in her flesh. Jack didn't wait to see what would happen next. He clawed his way to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, and bolted toward the tree line. Every step was agony, but he feared he would die if he stopped moving. He could hear the bear following him, but her injuries made her move slower. The forest blurred around him, branches slashing at his face as he ran. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The bear stopped pursuing him, perhaps too injured to continue. Jack kept running, but he collapsed a short while later, his body trembling with pain and exhaustion. He pressed his hand to his side, feeling the sticky warmth of blood seeping through his torn jacket. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. Days later, as Jack recovered from the ordeal, he knew he would never forget the lesson he had learned in those brutal, harrowing moments. The wilderness was unforgiving, and even the smallest act of compassion could have deadly consequences. The Alaska Range was unforgiving, but for Sarah, Ben, and Mike, 3 friends from Seattle, it was the ultimate escape. All 3 had grown up with a deep love for the outdoors, though none were seasoned wilderness experts. This trip was their way of reconnecting after years apart, a chance to challenge themselves and learn more about the wild. They were particularly interested in acquiring skills for surviving in harsh conditions, driven by a shared fear that the world might soon become inhospitable. They believed only the toughest people would survive. Choosing a remote spot for their campsite, they found themselves surrounded by towering peaks and dense forest. The snow line crept close, and the crisp autumn air hinted at the coming winter. By their second night, they felt confident. The tent was pitched on a flat stretch of ground, with a roaring fire nearby. The food was secured, or so they thought, hanging in a tree a good distance from the camp. They were lulled by the quiet majesty of the wilderness, the soft rustle of the wind through the pines, and the distant howl of wolves. But the wilderness was never truly silent, and its peace was as deceptive as the stillness before a storm. The bear came unheard. A massive grizzly, its senses sharpened by the oncoming harshness of winter, had caught the faint scent of food. It wasn't deterred by distance or obstacles. Hunger drove it, and when it reached the camp, it wasted no time asserting its claim. The tent's flimsy nylon walls stood no chance. Sarah woke first, just seconds before the others. Her heart jolted at the sound of heavy breathing and the loud rip of fabric. She barely had time to comprehend what was happening before the bear's hulking form crashed into the tent. The world around her erupted into chaos. Ben and Mike were jolted awake, scrambling against the collapsing structure as the bear tore through it, pawing at their sleeping bags and growling with a guttural force that shook them to their core. Mike, nearest to the opening, reacted first. Grabbing a flashlight, he shone it directly at the bear, hoping the beam would startle it. But the bear didn't flinch. It swung a massive paw, catching Mike in the chest and throwing him backward like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. He tried to move, but the bear was faster. In an instant, it slashed at Mike's chest. Sarah and Ben weren't cowards, but their instincts fought hard to override their desire to help their friend. They scrambled out of the tent, or what was left of it, and felt the cold bite into their skin as adrenaline surged. The bear was completely focused on Mike, looming over him as if deciding how to maul him next. After an agonizing second of dread and anticipation, the bear's jaws clamped down on Mike's arm. His muffled screams cut through the air, and blood soaked the dirt beneath him, dark and glistening in the faint moonlight. His flailing only seemed to agitate the bear further, its growls intensifying as it shook him like prey. It was then that Ben found his courage. He grabbed a nearby branch, dry and brittle, and swung it at the bear with all his strength. The wood shattered against its thick fur, doing little more than drawing its gaze. For a moment, the bear locked eyes with Ben, a primal challenge that froze him in place. Then it roared, a sound so loud that it vibrated in his chest. As Ben distracted the bear, Sarah's trembling hands worked to build a fire. The embers from the previous night's fire still glowed faintly, but they wouldn't be enough. She grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid they had left unsecured near the fire pit and poured it over the logs, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she struck a match. The flame shook dangerously before catching the soaked wood. A blaze erupted, casting flickering light and shadows across the campsite. If it hadn't been for this sudden brightness and heat, Mike would surely have been dead. But Sarah's fire was a small miracle. It caught the bear's attention. The animal released Mike, who crumpled to the ground, motionless and bloodied. The bear hesitated, its instincts warring with its hunger. Ben, seizing the moment, dragged Mike's limp body away from the creature, ignoring the sharp pain in his back as he strained against the weight. The bear paced, its massive form moving in and out of the firelight. Its growls turned to low, guttural rumbles. It was very possible, Sarah realized, that the bear had never seen fire before and was scared of it. Trusting this hunch, Sarah grabbed another branch, igniting the end and thrusting it toward the bear. The flames danced wildly, sending sparks into the night air. The animal was terrified of the flames and took off, running back into the dark forest. The campsite fell silent again, save for the crackling of the fire and the gasping breaths of the battered survivors. Mike's injuries were by far the worst. His chest bore 3 deep gouges, his arm was mangled, and his face was pale, smeared with blood and dirt. Sarah and Ben worked frantically, tearing their clothes into makeshift bandages and pressing them against his wounds to stem the bleeding. Every groan from Mike was a reminder of how close they had come to losing him. They knew they couldn't stay. The bear might return, and even if it didn't, Mike wouldn't survive without medical help. Ben quickly packed what little they had left while Sarah stayed by Mike's side, whispering reassurances to herself as much as to him. They called for help and frantically trekked to the trailhead. Ben and Sarah took turns dragging the makeshift sled they had fashioned to carry Mike, their muscles screaming in protest with every step. The bear's roar haunted them, echoing in their minds with each crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. When they finally saw the rescuers, they collapsed in relief. Mike was rushed to a hospital where he hovered between life and death for days. He survived, but the scars he bore would never fully heal, serving as a constant reminder of the night they had stared death in the face. David Pierce stood knee-deep in the clear, rushing water of Montana's Swan River, the fly rod in his hands trembling slightly with excitement. This was one of his first fishing trips, a self-imposed challenge to explore the wilderness he had admired from a distance his whole life, often from the safety of his own home. At 57, David wasn't what anyone would call an outdoorsman, but his instincts were sharp. He was quick to notice the subtle shift in the current or the rustling of brush on the riverbank. He had read books, watched videos, and prepped for every conceivable mishap, or so he thought. But no one is really ready for their day of reckoning. The river was alive with sounds that day, the gentle gurgle of water over stones, the chatter of distant birds, and the occasional rustle of trees in the cool autumn breeze. David had chosen this remote spot for its solitude, eager to test, or rather develop, his skills without distraction. His casts were clumsy but improving, and the thrill of his first catch felt within reach. He had been fishing for an hour when the shift in the atmosphere began. At first, it was subtle. The birds fell silent, and an uneasy stillness settled over the river. David's instincts prickled. Time and again he turned, scanning the forested bank behind him. The dense brush revealed nothing at first. But then, a few minutes later, he spotted a flash of fur, low and moving steadily toward him. His heart almost stopped. Dread overcame him instantly. A few seconds later, as the animal emerged from the brush, David realized his worst fears were true. There he was, armed only with a fishing rod, standing face to face with a massive grizzly. The bear sniffed the air, its dark eyes locking onto him. He realized too late that he hadn't properly secured the small bag of fish scraps he'd placed on the bank. The bear lumbered closer, its movements unnervingly silent. David's instincts screamed at him to act, to slowly back away, but fear rooted him to the spot. When the bear let out a low, rumbling growl, David lost his grip on the fishing rod. Without taking his eyes off the animal, he began to back toward the shore. It all happened in a flash. His foot caught on a submerged rock, and he stumbled, splashing noisily in the water. The bear's ears flicked forward, its demeanor shifting from curiosity to aggression. Then it charged, closing the distance in mere seconds. David's hands scrambled to find something, anything that might deter the bear. His fingers found a thick branch half buried in the mud, and he swung it with all his might as the bear lunged. The branch cracked against the bear's snout, but the blow only enraged it. In an instant, David found himself in the icy water. He realized the bear had struck him, the impact and the icy water knocking the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, the bear was on him, its jaws closing around his leg. Pain shot through him like fire as the teeth pierced flesh and muscle, dragging him deeper into the river. Instinct took over. David kicked with his free leg, his boot connecting with the bear's jaw. The bear growled but didn't let go. Desperation pushed him to act. He twisted onto his side, his hands flailing for a weapon. His fingers found a rock, smooth and heavy from years in the current. Gripping it tightly, he swung upward, striking the bear's head just above its eye. The bear roared, its grip loosening. David didn't wait. He lashed out again, this time with his fist, landing a desperate punch to its snout. It was the punch of a lifetime. The bear reared back, momentarily stunned, and David scrambled to his feet, his vision blurring from the pain. Blood from his leg painted the water around him, and every step was agony as he stumbled toward the shore. The bear didn't retreat immediately. It followed him, pacing in the shallows, its growls deep and resonant. David grabbed another branch from the bank, holding it in front of him like a spear. His vision blurred from pain and exhaustion, but he held his ground. The fire in his eyes met the bear's primal gaze, and for a tense moment, neither moved. Something in David's eyes made the creature realize this wasn't a fight it was willing to engage in. Slowly, it backed away, its attention shifting to the fish scraps that had drawn it in the first place. David didn't wait to see if it would change its mind. He turned and limped toward the trailhead where his truck was parked. Every step felt like a mile, his injured leg buckling beneath him. but he pushed forward, driven by the will to survive. By the time he reached his truck, his whole body was shaking. His clothes were soaked, his body streaked with blood, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He collapsed against the side of the vehicle, fumbling for his keys. The world spun around him as he finally slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, as if the metal and glass could protect him from the wilderness outside. David sat there for a long moment, his mind replaying the attack in vivid detail. The bear's eyes, its snarls, the sheer weight of its presence. It was a memory that would never leave him. His leg throbbed, the blood soaking into the fabric of his jeans. But the wounds weren't fatal. As he started the truck and drove back toward civilization, David felt a profound respect for the wilderness settle over him. The wild didn't care about his intentions or his excitement at being there. There was only one law out there: survive or perish. David knew he would return someday, but for now he needed to tend to his wounds and calm his nerves. He headed for the nearest town, where he could get stitches and a drink, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to process the raw power of the wilderness that still lingered in his mind. It was almost evening on August 27, 2022, as James Carter tightened the straps of his backpack and trudged along the North Carolina section of the Appalachian Trail. He'd chosen this hike on a whim, needing an escape after a day that felt like a relentless onslaught. At work, his latest project had been torn apart in a review, leaving him questioning his competence. At home, a heated argument with his girlfriend had driven him to despair. Hiking had always been James's refuge, a way to clear his head and plan ahead. The last rays of light filtered through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the trail. It was peaceful here, the quiet broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of birds. But despite the beauty surrounding him, James couldn't shake the tension in his chest. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, hoping it would calm the storm in his mind. He was caught in his thoughts, unable to escape their echoes of sorrow. But as he rounded a bend in the trail, his thoughts evaporated in an instant. Standing in the middle of the path, less than 20 feet ahead, was a black bear. The animal was big, bigger than black bears usually were. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as it sniffed the air. James froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He had encountered black bears before, and knew from experience that they were usually not aggressive. But this one was too close for comfort, and James was all alone. Even worse, he realized, he had forgotten to pack his bear spray. Cautiously, he began to back away, keeping his movement slow and steady. The bear kept looking at him. It lowered its head, its small eyes never leaving James. A huff escaped its mouth, and a chill ran through him. When the bear took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the trail, James knew he had to come up with an escape plan, and fast. His mind raced. He gripped the hiking pole tightly, holding it out in front of him. It wasn't much in terms of protection, but it would have to do. The bear advanced, sniffing the air and making direct eye contact with James. As he retreated, he found himself closer to the edge of the trail, where the ground sloped sharply downward into thick underbrush. There was nowhere left to go, he realized. The bear seemed to sense it too. In an instant, it lunged. The impact was brutal. James's backpack was sent skidding off to the side. He hit the ground hard, gulping for air. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his arm. The bear's claws had sunk deep into his forearm, pinning him in place. Gritting his teeth, James swung his hiking pole with all his strength, striking the bear across the snout. The bear growled, momentarily recoiling, but it didn't back off. Instead, it swiped at him again, its claws grazing his shoulder this time. James's arm throbbed, but he had no option but to fight. Again and again, he used the hiking pole to strike the bear's face. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the pole like a spear, waving it in front of him to keep the bear at bay. The bear advanced more cautiously this time. its growls low and menacing. James backed away, every step in agony, as the sharp incline of the trail strained his injured arm and shoulder. His breathing was ragged, and he felt dizzy from the effort of staying upright. The bear lunged once more, swiping at him with a paw the size of a dinner plate. James ducked, jabbing the hiking pole into its side. The bear roared, rearing up on its hind legs, towering over him. For a moment, James thought this was the end. The bear's immense bulk seemed to blot out the fading sunlight, its shadow engulfing him. But then it dropped back to all fours, its eyes fixed on him as if reassessing the fight. Seizing the opportunity, James struck the bear in the face again. This seemed to help the bear make up its mind. The human wasn't worth it. The bear turned away and started running in the opposite direction. James didn't wait to see if the bear would return. Clutching his bleeding arm to his chest, he staggered up the trail, almost intoxicated by happiness. He was alive. But as the trail twisted endlessly, James felt his strength waning. His vision swam, but he pressed on, focusing on one step at a time. When he finally saw the faint outline of the ranger station through the trees, relief washed over him like a wave. He stumbled into the clearing, collapsing against the building's wooden exterior. His body was battered, his clothes torn and stained with blood. His arm throbbed with every beat of his heart, but he was safe. As he was tended to and transported to safety, James felt a strange sense of gratitude. His instincts and quick thinking had saved him, which meant he probably wasn't a lost cause, no matter how many bad days came his way. In the moments after the attack, he found a newfound clarity. Life, with all its struggles, was worth fighting for. The experience had shaken him, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. Mark and Julia Thompson were halfway through a long-awaited drive through Colorado's Rocky Mountains. The crisp mountain air and golden rays of the setting sun painted the jagged peaks and winding roads in hues of orange and red. It was supposed to be the perfect end to a weekend escape from their stressful city life. Mark had been quiet for most of the trip, his mind still preoccupied with the fallout of a failed business deal, while Julia, sensing his tension, tried to fill the silence with observations about the scenery. The road ahead curved sharply, bordered by dense pine forests on either side. As the car rounded the bend, Julia suddenly gasped, and Mark hit the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was a bear. It was larger than either of them had imagined a bear could be, its shiny coat catching the fading sunlight. The animal stood motionless, its dark eyes locked onto the car, its presence both fascinating and worrisome. Mark, still lost in thoughts of his business deal, honked the horn, the sharp sound echoing off the trees. He didn't have time to marvel at this creature. He needed to get home and get to work. But the bear was oblivious to all of this. It didn't flinch. Instead, it took a few slow steps forward, its movements deliberate, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then, something terrifying happened. The bear lunged at the car, slamming its massive paws onto the hood with a force that made the vehicle shudder. Deep gouges appeared in the paint as its claws raked across the metal. Julia's hand flew to her mouth as she let out a cry of terror, and Mark's pulse raced as he jammed the horn again, hoping the noise would scare the animal off. A moment later, the bear retreated, dropping back onto all fours and stepping away from the vehicle. It lingered near the tree line, its body half hidden in shadow. Mark exhaled, his adrenaline still surging. The hood of the car was dented, the scratches deep enough to expose bare metal beneath. Unbeknownst to Mark, the bear was still close by. He told Julia he needed a minute to check the damage and unlocked his door. Stepping out, his boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, he moved cautiously toward the front of the car. It happened so fast that Mark didn't have time to react. The bear charged with terrifying speed, its roar cutting through the stillness like a thunderclap. Mark barely managed to raise his arms as the bear's weight slammed into him, throwing him backward against the car. Not only did he collide with the metal, but the bear's claws also sliced at his chest. Mark scrambled to get back inside, gripping the edge of the door for support. The bear swiped again, its claws catching his leg this time, ripping through his jeans and drawing blood. Mark fell into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as the bear's paw struck it. The entire car rocked under the impact. Julia, frozen in shock for a moment, snapped into action. She fumbled for the gear shift, her hands trembling as she tried to start the car. The bear, enraged, moved to the side of the car, growling and swiping at the windows. The sound of its claws on the glass was deafening. The tires squealed as Julia reached over Mark and pressed the gas, but the car barely moved before a loud pop reverberated through the cabin. The bear had slashed the rear tires, leaving them trapped. Mark groaned beside her, clutching his chest, his shirt stained with blood. His breathing was shallow, and Julia's panic rose as she glanced in the rearview mirror to see the bear circling back toward the driver's side. The animal reared onto its hind legs, towering over the car, its breath fogging the glass. Meanwhile, a bleeding Mark managed to shift into reverse, hoping the remaining tires could handle the strain. The car lurched backward, the uneven rhythm of the damaged tires creating a sickening thud, thud, thud. The bear didn't give up easily. It lunged again, its paw slamming against the trunk and leaving another deep dent. Mark gripped the wheel tightly, trying to keep the car on the narrow road as it bucked and jolted beneath them. Julia tried to apply pressure to his wounds. With a final burst of adrenaline, Mark floored the gas. The car skidded, the rear fishtailing, but it finally broke free of the bear's reach. The animal stopped chasing after a few seconds, its dark form growing smaller in the rearview mirror as Mark pressed on the accelerator. After a few minutes, they swapped places, and Julia drove for several more miles until they reached a small ranger station down the road. Her hands were still trembling as she turned off the ignition. Mark leaned heavily against the passenger's door, his injuries making every movement agonizing. Rangers rushed to their aid, their faces grim as they assessed Mark's wounds and listened to Julia recount the encounter. They assured her that bears were rarely this aggressive, but she could see the worry in their eyes. If there was one thing they knew for sure, it was that the peaceful drive they had imagined had turned into nothing short of a nightmare. Mark and Julia were both shaken to their core. They knew Mark's injuries would heal with time, but the memory of the bear's relentless attack, the weight of its body, the sound of its claws tearing into metal and flesh, would stay with them forever. As they sat together in the safety of the station, Mark and Julia realized how fragile the line was between human control and the raw power of nature. Ethan Miller loved the scenery of the John Muir Trail. It was where he felt most alive, far from the noise of his work and the pressures of everyday life. This trip was special, not just for the breathtaking views, but because it was Scout's first long hike. The 2-year-old Labrador bounded ahead on the trail, his tail wagging happily in the air. Ethan smiled as he watched Scout sniff at wildflowers and dart after butterflies, his energy infectious. The day was perfect, the sky an endless expanse of blue, and the air crisp and cool. They had covered nearly 10 miles and were nearing a campsite when Scout froze, his ears erect. Ethan slowed, scanning the dense forest ahead. A rustling sound reached his ears. When a grizzly bear emerged from the trees, Ethan wasn't surprised. Terrified, yes, but not surprised. The young man's breath hitched as the massive animal stepped onto the trail, its presence dominating the space. The bear's fur was a tawny brown, its hulking shoulders rising and falling with each step. It sniffed the air, its small eyes flicking between Ethan and Scout. Scout barked, a sharp, high-pitched sound that broke the stillness. The bear's head snapped toward the dog, its lips pulling back to reveal long, yellowed teeth. Ethan's instinct screamed for him to grab Scout, to run, to do something. But before he could act, the bear lunged. Scout tried to get away, but the bear was faster, more determined. Its powerful jaws clamped down on the dog's flank, lifting him off the ground with horrifying ease. Scout yelped, his legs kicking in the air as the bear shook him like a rag doll. Ethan's body moved before his brain could catch up. He unsheathed the knife from his belt, its blade small but sharp. His heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance between himself and the bear, shouting and waving his arms to draw its attention. The bear growled, a sound that vibrated in Ethan's bones. It dropped Scout to the ground and turned its massive bulk toward Ethan. Scout lay motionless, a dark stain spreading across his golden fur. Ethan slashed wildly with the knife as the bear reared onto its hind legs, towering over him. One swipe from its paw sent him crashing to the ground. The bear's claws sliced into his arm, and his knife clattered out of his hand, landing just out of reach. The bear loomed over him, its breath hot and foul. Ethan scrambled backward, his injured arm throbbing, blood dripping onto the dirt. He groped blindly for the knife, his fingers finally closing around the handle. As the bear lunged again, Ethan thrust the blade upward, catching the animal just below its jaw. The bear roared, its deafening cry echoing through the forest. It pulled back, shaking its massive head and dislodging the blade. Seizing the moment, Ethan crawled toward Scout. The dog whimpered as Ethan grabbed him by the scruff and pulled him to his feet. His injured arm burned as he hoisted Scout into his arms, his legs wobbling beneath the combined weight of fear and exhaustion. Ethan stumbled back onto the trail, the bear's roar still ringing in his ears. It was coming after them, its heavy footfalls crunching through the underbrush. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Every ounce of his focus was on putting as much distance as possible between them and the enraged predator. The trail seemed endless, the trees closing in like walls. Scout's limp body grew heavier with each step, and Ethan's breaths came in ragged gasps. Behind him, the bear's snarls grew fainter. It was slowing, perhaps losing interest, but Ethan didn't dare stop. His legs burned, his vision blurred, but he kept running, driven by sheer instinct. When the ranger station came into view, Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. The small wooden building stood as a beacon of safety in the wilderness. He staggered up the steps, shouldering the door open and collapsing inside. Scout let out a soft whine, his eyes fluttering open as Ethan set him down on the floor. Ethan pressed his back against the door, his entire body trembling. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his mind raced through the events of the past few minutes. It felt like hours for the adrenaline to wear off and the reality of the attack to sink in. Scout's wounds were deep, but not fatal. Ethan's arm would need stitches, but he was alive. The thought of how close they had come to losing everything made him shudder. The wilderness had always been Ethan's refuge, a place of peace and simplicity. But now it felt different. It was still beautiful, still awe-inspiring, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable humans truly were in the face of nature's raw power. As Ethan sat there, his injured dog resting beside him, he knew he would never forget the bear's charge, the weight of its presence, the sound of its growls, and the sharp, primal fear that had coursed through him. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving, and Ethan knew he would never risk Scout's life again. Scout had to undergo multiple surgeries. When they finally returned home, the world seemed different, quieter, more fragile. Ethan carried Scout into the house, his movements careful and deliberate despite his own lingering pain. The following days were a blur of recovery. Ethan tended to Scout's injuries with meticulous care, feeding him by hand and checking the bandages daily. Scout, though slower and quieter than before, wagged his tail weakly, his trust in Ethan unwavering. For Ethan, the attack lingered in his mind, replaying in vivid flashes whenever he closed his eyes. Yet as he sat beside Scout, stroking the dog's fur while he healed, Ethan felt a sense of gratitude. gratitude for their survival, for the bond between them, and for the hard, unforgettable lesson about the raw power of the natural world.